Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 777 for July 21st, 2019. Coming up in a few minutes.
Amrut approached my partners back then and said, what about the U.S.? And I just moved to the U.S. and they called me and said, hey, what about this? And I said, well, there's no good Indian whiskey. And they said, no, there is. This is really good. And I tried it, fell in love with it.
Raj Sabharwal is one of those people helping to satisfy the demand for world whiskies, those whiskeys that come from so-called non-traditional whiskey-making countries. His Glass Revolution Imports is the U.S. importer for Amrut's single malts from India, along with Hammerhead from the Czech Republic, the English Whiskey Company from England, and many other brands, along with Blackadder's independent bottlings from Scotland. He's the middleman between distillers overseas and distributors in the U.S., and much of the growing interest in those whiskeys has come as a result of battles he fought with U.S. regulators over the years. You'll hear our conversation later on WhiskyCast In-Depth, along with the What I'm Tasting This Week department, your voice, and a whole lot more. All on this edition of WhiskyCast.
WhiskyCast, brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot-still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. Diageo could soon be facing a strike by the unions representing workers at its facilities in Scotland. Both Unite and the GMB rejected the company's final offer with a 2.8% increase in annual pay and benefits. Together, the two unions represent around 1,500 workers at Diageo's distilleries, warehouses, and bottling plants around Scotland. That's about half of the company's total workforce in Scotland. Unite has told various media outlets that it will conduct a strike vote among its members. No word yet from GMB on its plans as we're recording this episode. Diageo executives say they're willing to keep talking. Back in December, we reported on Diageo's plans to build a new $130 million distillery in Lebanon, Kentucky. Construction has now started on the project, which is scheduled to open in 2021. The company has not said which of its bourbon and American whiskey brands will be made at the new distillery, but has indicated that it will be able to produce a variety of different whiskeys there. Meanwhile, the new Holyrood distillery is set to become Edinburgh's first malt whiskey distillery in nearly a century when it opens next week. The grand opening is set for July 30th, just in time for fringe events in August. The distillery is located on the edge of Holyrood Park. And elsewhere in Scotland, Bladnoch Distillery in Wigtown will open its new visitors' centre this Thursday. It's the final step in the 4-year-long renovation of Bladnoch after Australian entrepreneur David Pryor bought the distillery out of administration back in 2015. And in the States, J. Rieger & Company has now opened its new distillery and visitors center in Kansas City, Missouri. It includes 2 full-service cocktail bars and a 60,000-square-foot distillery. In other news, Tales of the Cocktail wrapped up Saturday night in New Orleans with the 13th annual Spirited Awards presentation, and there was a new award added to this year's event. The first-ever Spirited Award for Philanthropy went to Speed Rack co-founders Lynette Marrero and Ivy Mix. Speed Rack is an international competition for women working as bartenders. Speed Rack events have raised almost $1 million to fight breast cancer, as Lynette Marrero told us last year.
We have been able, through the last 7 years, with the money we've raised, help and support different charities that tackle the problem from many places, from research to community-run support to screenings to... So we're really helping, and a few of the companies that we've been working with have even been able to double their efforts and become 24-hour hotlines for people who find out that they're diagnosed with breast cancer. So it's been really great to see the work and that this community has all donated to be able to have an effect outside the world.
You can hear the complete interview with Lynette Marrero in episode 707 of WhiskyCast from June of 2018. It's available in the archives at whiskycast.com. And we'd like to add our congratulations to Lynette and Ivy, who also won the award for Best Bar Mentors as well. Dante in New York City was named the world's best bar at the Spirited Awards, while the Atlas Bar in Singapore won the award for the world's best spirits selection. We should note that WhiskyCast was one of the finalists again this year for Best Broadcast, Podcast, or Online Video Series, and we send our congratulations to this year's winner, the folks at the Bartender at Large podcast. At least one new whiskey made its debut at Tales. Woodford Reserve unveiled a new straight wheat whiskey. It'll go on sale next month, but no details on pricing have been announced yet. Chivas Brothers is expanding its Royal Salute 21-year-old range for the first time since launching the brand in 1953. The flagship 21-year-old is now being referred to as the Signature Blend, while the Malts Blend is a new blended malt featuring vintage malt whiskeys from more than 21 different distilleries. The Lost Blend uses whiskeys from long-closed distilleries, including some peated whiskeys. It's now available in travel retail, while the Malts Blend will be available at domestic whiskey shops. Both are priced at around $135 a bottle. Back in May, we reported that Glenmorangie was changing its port cask-finished Quinta Reuben single malt from a 12-year-old to a 14-year-old expression. Now there's word that the Sauterne cask-finished Nectar d'Or will lose its 12-year-old age statement completely and become a no-age statement single malt, but bottled at 46% ABV with no chill filtering. The sherry cask-finished La Santa will remain a 12-year-old, bottled at 43% ABV. England's Lakes Distillery is expanding its range of the One blended whiskey with a new port cask-finished expression. The One blends the distillery's own single malt whiskey with Scotch malt and grain whiskies from Speyside and Islay. It'll be available at UK retailers for 48 pounds a bottle, about $60 US. Lafroig unveiled its annual Kerchis release at the end of May during Fay Gilles on Islay, and now the Kerchis Triple Wood Cask Strength Single Malt is getting a wider release. It's matured in a series of ex-bourbon barrels, followed by quarter casks and then Oloroso sherry casks. It's bottled at 59.5% ABV and will sell in the U.S. for around $80 a bottle. Glenfiddich was the first distillery in Scotland to open a visitors' centre way back in 1969. And to celebrate the 50th anniversary this year, the distillery is releasing 200 commemorative bottles of a single cask Glenfiddich. The cask was filled on Christmas Day in 1987, which was the distillery's 100th anniversary. The 200 bottles will be sold only at the Glenfiddich Visitors Center at £1,600 each, about $2,000 US. And finally, one of the rarest Japanese whiskey sets around will go on the auction block August 16th at Bonham's in Hong Kong. The 54-bottle set of Ichiro Akuto's Cards series from the closed Hanyu distillery may be one of the few complete sets left in the world, and Bonham's projects bidding could reach more than $750,000. The last time a complete set went on the block at Bonham's back in 2015, it sold for around $475,000 at current exchange rates. You can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com. The news is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. Keeping American whiskey history and tradition alive isn't just a marketing slogan. It's part of Heaven Hill's fabric. When other distillers were getting out of the rye whiskey business, Heaven Hill saved the legendary Rittenhouse rye from becoming a footnote in the history books. Today it's the rye whiskey of choice, in a cocktail or neat, with a distinct spicy flavor all its own. Find out more at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. Whiskey Brothers, the only whiskey show, is this Thursday and Friday in Sandton, South Africa. Whiskey Life Perth is Friday and Saturday in Perth, Australia, and Tasmania's Ironhouse Distillery has a Tasman whiskey release party in South Burnie on Saturday. Wands and Whiskey, for you Harry Potter fans, is July 30th in Philadelphia, and Delilah's in Chicago has a party with Maker's Mark that night to celebrate the bar's 15,000th bottle of Maker's Mark. Balcones Distillery hosts Waco Women and Whiskey for an evening of cocktails and conversation on August 9th in Waco, Texas. Whiskey Fringe 2019 is the 9th through the 11th in Edinburgh, Scotland. The first Bourbon on the Banks Festival is that same weekend in Frankfort, Kentucky. And the Bourbon Women's Annual Symposium Conference is August 23rd through the 25th in Louisville. Right now, we have 205 different events on our searchable calendar at whiskycast.com. We're adding new events all the time. Just use the search button to find events near you or wherever you'll be traveling soon.
From deep in the north, far beyond the wall, the howl of the frozen wind brings word of something new. A whiskey from the land of always winter, for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
Pour yourself a bourbon and settle into a good story. Heaven Hill's Backroom Stories, told by those who've rarely shared before just how they shape the spirit and how the spirit shapes them.
All the barrels are aging here. A lot of the airflow through the warehouse like this, when you open the door, all that goodness hits you in the face. And, it's something you never forget.
Download and listen to the new podcast, Tales from the Hill, from Heaven Hill Distillery. Season 1 is available now on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Mortlach. If you look closely at the labels on whiskeys imported into the U.S., you'll see the name of the company responsible for bringing that whiskey into the U.S. The major whiskey brands that are part of global drinks companies often have their own U.S. divisions that serve as the importers. For instance, there's Diageo North America, Pernod Ricard USA, and Edrington Americas, just to name a few. Then there are the independent importers, much smaller businesses who sign deals with brands for the exclusive right to import their whiskeys into the U.S. Those importers buy the whiskeys from the distillery, cover the cost of shipping, getting the required label approvals from the federal government, and then they have to try to get distributors to carry those whiskeys and sell them to retailers, bars, and restaurants. It's a huge gamble, especially when you're dealing with a relatively unknown brand trying to break into the U.S., or any market for that matter. Raj Sabharwal has rolled the dice on more than a few of those brands over the last decade. He owns Glass Revolution Imports and is the U.S. importer for Amrut, the English whiskey company, and Blackadder, just to name a few. We sat down over lunch this week in Philadelphia. Let's talk politics, first of all. What happens if the proposal to deregulate bottle sizes goes through? That has to be a good thing for you and all of your other colleagues in the import community.
I absolutely agree, Mark. I mean, the consumers are always disappointed in, these great releases in Japan, great releases in Scotland. Why can't we have those? And the 750 ml, 375 ml regulations have always prohibited 700s and 500 mLs from coming in.
Part of my thinking on this is that while the official reason is consumer choice, deregulation, and removing barriers to industry, the impression I'm getting after reading some of the stories coming out of Washington is that the word has gone down from the White House that thou shalt deregulate wherever possible, and this is low-hanging fruit for the TTB.
It's certainly low-hanging fruit, but I mean, it's, historically we look back at why 750 was even put into place, and it was, some people say it was for mathematics. It was easier to multiply by 75 than 70 because they didn't have computers back then. But for whatever reason, I mean, I think that, as I said earlier, if we deregulate and they stipulate a minimum and a maximum size, it should be great. I mean, wine and sake can come in different sizes. Why can't spirits?
The other thing I thought was interesting is that I never thought the U.S. would consider giving this up without the European Union giving up 70 CLs or allowing 75s in, and the U.S. is doing this unilaterally. I'm not sure they've figured out that they're actually capitulating to the EU on this.
I think you're probably right, and as you said earlier, it's probably deregulate wherever you can, and it's low-hanging fruit. So it's good it is, and hopefully it will go through, and will make consumers a lot more happier.
Also on the political front, the entire rewrite of Title 27 standards and the labeling requirements, that's one where you've had an issue for years because there's never been a category for single malt whiskeys in there. And we've had this discussion going back to when you first brought Amrut in. They didn't address that in this one either, did they?
They haven't. However, I mean, there is the American Distillers Association, the single malt group that is trying to get a designation for American single malt, and hopefully that will open the door to getting a designation for single malt whiskeys. I mean, single malt whiskeys, it only makes up, 10% of what comes out of Scotland, but there's so much more single malts around the world now that I think we need to have some designation. The one good thing is that we no longer have to submit samples to the TTB lab for their review and deciding what category it fits under. So it's made it a lot easier for us because they've done away with that.
But you've had problems on multiple fronts because you were bringing in Amrut. I remember the English Whiskey Company, even though England is part of the UK, it didn't count. But even though Scotland is part of the UK, that didn't count either. Let's recount some of the issues you've had over the years.
Well, Amrut was the first one. I mean, when we first submitted it, the TTB came back and said we had to call it a straight malt whiskey. And I said, what the hell is a straight malt whiskey? And, the consumers are going to be confused. So they did capitulate and allow us to use, they called it a malt whiskey, and it was okay to add the word single. Then the English whiskey, as you said, we went through the same thing. Sullivan's Cove, we went through it, and that was it for back then. But they were all issues. I think, the Japanese distilleries have certainly struggled with that issue as well, trying to get single malt from Japan labeled as a single malt.
And let's explain why we have this problem. There is no technical definition for single malt in any of the regulations in the U.S., is there?
There is not. There is whiskey, obviously the broad category. There is malt whiskey, but that only means it has to be 50% malted grain that goes into it. There is nothing that specifically follows the Scottish regulations or any other country's regulations and says this is what single malt whiskey will be.
The reason we have the Scotch single malts that can come in without this issue are that the U.S. basically allowed Scotland, Ireland, and Canada to define for themselves what their whiskeys are, and the U.S. automatically accepts those. So when you start bringing in whiskeys from these other countries, that's where the problem came in, right?
Correct. I mean, the other countries, those three countries you mentioned, Canada, Scotland, Ireland, were the largest producers and suppliers of of whiskey, barley whiskey, and the rest didn't matter. But now we're seeing, like I said earlier, we were seeing single malts out of Czech, out of Germany, out of South Africa, different European countries, Norway, Denmark. Good quality products that are coming out. Even in the U.S., the whole movement towards single malt has come out in about the last 8 to 10 years.
Let's talk about that explosion, because it really has been an explosion of whiskeys from all over the world, and you've sort of been at the forefront of it.
Well, I think as consumers have become more aware of and more liking of single malt whiskeys, or whiskey in general, they've tried to explore other categories. And there was always the sort of hindrance, the perception that single malt whiskey or Scotch whiskey was always peated. And now consumers are saying, oh, no, it's not peated. I mean, we know that even peated whiskeys out of Scotland only make up a small percentage. But it was just, that's what, somebody's dad or granddad drank, was peated whiskey out of Scotland. But as consumers are saying there's different varieties, different taste sensations, that's helping them, consumers, to explore and try different things.
How did you wind up getting into the import business to begin with?
I fell into it. I got tired of working for the corporate world and decided to follow my passion and do something that was more interesting and something that I could control more. And so started off, in April next year, we're celebrating our 10th anniversary. And the first product we brought in was Amrut. And, we've continued to sort of lead the wave of bringing in single malt whiskeys from non-traditional countries.
And you started out in Canada, too, as part of Purple Valley with Jonathan Bray, right?
Yeah, my partners were there in Canada, and they had a number of products, including Amrut and Sullivan's Cove. And Amrut approached my partners back then and said, what about the U.S.? And I just moved to the U.S., and they called me and said, hey, what about this? And I said, well, there's no good Indian whiskey. And they said, no, there is. This is really good. And I tried it, fell in love with it. The rest is history, as they say. We started off 10 years ago. When we brought it in, we were in 3 states. Now we're in 45 states. And the sales of Amrut continue to grow.
And you're really Amrut's biggest importer in the world, right?
We are. We are their single largest export market in the world.
How has that whiskey gone over? You've said it's from 3 states to 45, but it was a hard sell at first, trying to convince people that Indian whiskey could be on the same level as single malt scotches. They had that same issue when they debuted it in England and Scotland.
Right, and obviously by tasting, getting people to taste it and comparing it, doing blind tastings. I equate it to Japanese whiskey, where Japanese whiskey was about 8 years ago, where a lot of consumers hadn't heard of it. They were still the perception it was made out of rice, which ironically some Japanese whiskey is. But the true single malt barley whiskeys that are coming out of Japan are blowing people away, and I think that Indian single malts are on the cusp of that. And as other world single malts come in, we're going to see a whole greater consumer appreciation of those.
For those who are not aware of how the system works, you're the importer, but you're not the distributor. You don't deal directly with retailers. Explain how this system works on an import side for the importer like you, a small business that works with the distilleries outside the country.
So the classic 3-tier system in the U.S., where you can't be all 3, except in some states. But as the importer, we take the risk of deciding what products to bring in, where they're coming in from. We do all the paperwork, all the legal things that have to be done, bring it into the country, and then we have to have appointed distributors, usually one in every state that we deal with, that is going to handle the products. And the distributors in turn sell to retailers and bars and restaurants, the exception being the 14 controlled states that we still have to deal with, and those are, you're selling directly to the state entity that then marks it up and has it in their retail operations.
So you essentially are the ultimate middleman between the distilleries and the distribution network in the States.
Right. We are the sole source. Every product we bring in, we are the exclusive importer of those. So they wouldn't be here if it wasn't for us.
How often do you get pitched by distilleries that want you to pick up their products?
Probably a number of times a year. It used to be a lot more. It's slowed down a little bit, but we're still getting that. Not only we used to get whiskey because we were known for whiskey, but now we're, I probably get offered a gin every week, which I don't want another gin. I mean, I think that, there's a lot of gin being made just for the sake of making it. We tend to look for products that have a history, that are family-owned distilleries, that have a uniqueness or authenticity to it.
Are there ones you've turned away that wound up becoming successful with other distributors or importers?
Nothing comes to mind. There's ones that we've lost. We started them in the U.S., and through acquisitions of the distilleries, we've lost those. But there's nothing that we've turned away that comes to mind that we wish we had kept or we wish we had latched onto.
And that's the other problem you face, is that distilleries get sold, brands get sold, and sometimes those brands, that sale comes with or goes to a company that has its own import arm.
Correct. So we have put agreements into place with our suppliers just for that, because obviously we work to build up the brand in the country, and if it's distillery is sold and another owner comes in and says, I'm going to change the distribution channel, all that work that we've done, we get no return from it.
It's not like a franchise agreement that a lot of the distributors have with the brands in the U.S. where the brand can't break that deal.
Yeah, that's more so in the franchise states where that exists, where, but there are a lot that try to protect the brand, and obviously that makes sense, because if you're going to put the effort into working on a brand and building it up, you want to protect your investment.
I guess at this point we need to go back to politics and talk about tariffs. You import a number of whiskeys that would be impacted by the Trump administration's proposal to add tariffs on whiskeys from the European Union.
Correct. So our Blackadder, which we import, Murray McDavid, Hammerhead, to name a few of the European sourced made products, a 25% tariff would be devastating. I mean, I think we'd feel the effect immediately on the price, because right now there is no tariff on whiskey. It comes in tax-free. There is an excise tax you pay on it, but there's no customs duty on it. And I think ultimately it's the consumer that's going to feel the pinch of it. I mean, all of a sudden the consumer is paying 25+% more than they are currently paying for their product, and it's tough on people to afford good quality products, and all of a sudden if it's up 25%, that's going to be devastating. And also for the whole industry, I mean, I think it's going to affect retailers, it's going to affect bars and restaurants, and it's the job loss. I think I read somewhere 10 or 15,000 people would lose their jobs in the U.S. probably very shortly after if this was put in place.
And this is not a case of your clients over in Europe paying this tax. You're paying this tax when it hits the border.
Correct. We would have to pay it once it arrived and eat that tax up or pass it on. And 25 percentage points is a lot to absorb. And so obviously our selling costs to our distributors would go up, and they in turn would have higher costs to sell to retailers who then sell to consumers. So it's a ripple effect. I mean, it might be 25% at the beginning, but by the time it hits the end, it's it could be 60 or 70%.
And that's the price that we'll pay at the end when we buy the drink.
Correct.
Makes the corporate world sound a lot better now, doesn't it?
No, I still would rather be doing what I'm doing than being back in the corporate world.
Raj mentioned the problem importers face when a distillery changes hands. And here's one example. He was the original U.S. importer for Sullivan's Cove single malts from Australia. But after the distillery was sold at the end of 2016, the new owners decided to change their marketing and export strategy. They switched to a different importer and are only selling their whiskeys in New York and California for now. That's WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Mortlach, whiskey's best-kept secret, hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies. Comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlock lineup at malts.com. Let's start off the What I'm Tasting This Week department with one of the Amrut single casks that Raj Sabharwal recently brought into the U.S. This one is an exclusive bottling for Norfolk Wines and Spirits in Massachusetts, and Raj brought a sample for me to taste. Cask number 662 was a first fill ex-bourbon barrel filled in October of 2012 and bottled this April at 60% ABV. The nose is malty with notes of molasses, brown sugar, toffee, muted spices, and just a touch of oak. The taste is peppery but well balanced with toffee, molasses, and brown sugar sweetness, along with some oak tannins. The finish, long and sweet with a touch of spice. I'm scoring the Amrut Special Limited Edition cask number 662 a 93. And staying in Massachusetts for now, I stopped off to see Ryan Maloney at Julio's Liquors in Westboro, Massachusetts last weekend, and he gave me a sample of his new Cavalan single cask. It's nicknamed Portamento, and as you might guess, it's a port cask matured Cavalan, bottled at 57.8% ABV. The nose has notes of plums, toffee, gentle spices, a soft oakiness, and hints of anise and spearmint in the background. The taste is full of red grapes, plums, clove, cinnamon, anise, and oak tannins. The finish is long with lingering dark fruits and subtle spices. I'm scoring the Cavalan Portamento single cask a 93. And last month we heard from the Glenlivet's Alan Winchester about his latest mystery malt, the Glenlivet Enigma. I received a sample this week. It's bottled at 60.6% ABV and comes in a black bottle with no other details about the whiskey. As Alan told us, the idea is to taste it with no preconceived notions. So, for me, the nose is malty and fruity, with tart touches of citrus, along with butterscotch candies, ginger, allspice, and a touch of sandalwood. The taste is thick and chewy, with a malty sweetness and honey at first, followed by allspice and ginger with a citrusy tartness, and hints of butterscotch, licorice, and oak sawdust add some complexity in the background. The finish is long and subtle with touches of citrus, sandalwood, and licorice. I like the complexity on this one. I'm scoring the Glenlivet Enigma a 93. I'm adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 2,600 different whiskeys from all over the world. You'll find it at WhiskyCast.com.
Redbreast fans have always cherished our whiskey's sherry notes, so we set out to embellish that character. Introducing the Redbreast Listowel edition, a quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey finished in first fill Oloroso sherry casks from Spain's prestigious Bodegas Listowel. Carrying Redbreast's trademark pot still spices and dark dried fruit notes, the Listowel edition is graced with an enduring sherry finish that would be better described as a final act. Discover the newest branch on the Redbreast family tree.
Let's open up the inbox now for your voice, brought to you by Lot 40. Last time around, I mentioned the new Jameson Triple Triple Irish Whiskey that's just been released in travel retail. Jerry O'Sullivan at Pogues 1977 on Twitter tweeted this to us this weekend. WhiskyCast, my wife just came home from Ireland and brought me back a bottle of Jameson Triple Triple. I'm looking forward to tasting it. Meanwhile, Tom at the Tracer Bullet tweeted this the other day. Headed to Sagamore Spirit last evening in the storms to get the 2019 Whiskey Thief Barrel Select Rye Whiskey. We'll be tasting it this weekend. On that note, Tom sent us a tweet back in May after his last visit to Sagamore Spirit in Baltimore with a photo of a barrel-marked Islay Scotch Finish Rye Whiskey that was filled last November. And his message then, saw this, need more information. Well, I suggested at the time that Sagamore Spirit President Brian Tracy might be able to help answer that question. Brian responded this week. Sorry for the delayed response, just getting back online. Let's just say it is one of our 50-plus barrels of R&D. Thanks for the answer, Brian. I suspect Tom will be curious about the results of that R&D work. Mike W. Simpson tweeted this question from Edmonton, Alberta. Is it as simple as trying many whiskeys to develop one's palate? Is there credibility to whiskey classes? Thanks in advance. Good question, Mike. It is not quite as simple as that, but it's not hard to develop your palate. You can taste all the whiskeys you want, but unless you taste other things to compare them with, it'll be hard to pick up the subtleties. I've often given my business partner, Christina Filburn, a lot of the credit for helping me develop my palate. She's a great cook, and one of the things I did was go through her spice racks and try to learn the various smells and tastes. You can also go through the produce section at the supermarket to see how different fruits and vegetables smell, and of course you can pay closer attention as you're eating to how different foods smell and taste. Smells and flavors are really just mental memories that we learn to associate with a particular scent or taste. And if I can learn to do it, you can too. As for whiskey classes and their credibility, the key thing is to find out who's teaching the class and what their background is. In some cases, the teacher may have taken a for-profit class and then become certified to teach it themselves. And while I'm not going to mention any names, there are some so-called whiskey educators out there that promise to make you, quote, a level 1 whiskey sommelier after just 1 2-day class at a cost of several $1,000s. Look at the price tag, the instructors, and then ask around on social media. Chances are pretty good someone who has taken that class will probably have posted feedback online. But as with all things, trust your own instincts. If your bullshit detector is sounding an alarm, listen to it. Now, this week's Whiskey Photo of the Week featured the stained glass window that's in one of the warehouses at Bladnoch Distillery in Huntly, Scotland. You can see it on our social media feeds and at the WhiskyCast website. Ian Stewart posted this on our Facebook page. My girlfriend is taking stained glass classes. How to talk her into making one for me. Oh, geez, Ian. You could take the classes with her and make one yourself. That way you could show it off and brag about how you made it. Maybe even share a photo of it with us, too. If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always get in touch with us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Your voice is presented by Lot 40, Canada's award-winning 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Let's close things out now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and other things that make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. And I'd like to go back to our interview with Raj Sabharwal for just a minute. While we focused on the U.S. import business in talking with Raj, it is important to remember that independent importers operate all over the world. For instance, the famous La Maison du Whisky in Paris also serves as an importer and distributor for many whiskey brands throughout Europe. For example, La Maison du Whisky handles Nikka Whiskey's marketing and distribution around Europe. It arranges for shipments from Japan, then distributes those whiskeys to either local distributors in some countries or directly to retailers, bars, and restaurants where it can, including its own shops in Paris. Now, that would not be allowed in most of the United States, where laws put into place at the end of Prohibition set up what is known today as the 3-tier system in most states. If you're a whiskey maker, or in Raj's case, an importer, that's the first tier. As Raj explained, regional distributors are the second tier. Those are companies who secure the rights to distribute a specific brand in a specific region, usually an entire state or a part of a state. And most states have laws banning whiskey makers or importers from owning a distribution company. Then there's the retail tier, bars, restaurants, and retailers. They buy their inventory from the distributors, and the same laws that ban cross-ownership in the first two tiers usually ban those companies from owning retailers. Here's one example. Before Ken Lewis could open New Riff Distilling in Newport, Kentucky, back in 2014, he had to decide whether he wanted to sell whiskey or make it. He and his family owned the Party Source chain of liquor stores in northern Kentucky, but under Kentucky's law, he could not keep the liquor stores and own a distillery. So he sold the stores to his employees and opened the distillery. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why is this the case? Well, before Prohibition, one of the many problems that corrupted the industry was so-called tied houses. That's where a bar or a retailer was essentially a front for the drinks companies and was either owned by the company or had an exclusive agreement to sell only that company's products. And this was really more of a problem for the beer industry than it was for spirits. But when regulators started working on a post-prohibition marketplace for alcohol, they decided it would make sense to set up firewalls between alcohol producers and the retail sector to keep that problem from coming back. Of course, there are so-called control states where the state government controls either the distribution tier, the retail tier, or both. And the system has gradually been loosened in many states to allow craft distillers to have a limited retail presence and operate their own tasting rooms. In some states, small distillers who produce below a specific level can also self-distribute their own whiskeys to retailers. That's just one of the reasons why alcoholic beverages are some of the most strictly regulated consumer products on the market. If you have something you'd like us to look at on Behind the Label, just use the contact form at whiskeycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copperpot, a unique triple-distilled premium Irish whiskey, combining single malt and single pot still. First fashioned in the 1700s and still a rarity today. Sure, as we say in Ireland, what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copperpot.
That's all for this episode of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskeycast.com. That's also where you can find links for our WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast and our WhiskyCast HD videos, the latest whiskey news, tasting notes, the whiskey photo of the week, cocktail recipes, and a whole lot more, including a complete archive of past episodes. Please take just a minute this week to tell a friend or two about WhiskyCast. If you're not already subscribing to WhiskyCast with Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app, take a minute this week to click on the subscribe button. That way you won't miss a single episode. You can always reach us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at WhiskyCast. Our email address is comments@whiskeycast.com.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2019, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.